You must not clap for so long time. I would have played for you something else in 3 minutes. I have the impression you would like now Tico Tico. Yes? Now play for you, still one for you, the really last one. And I want to say thank you to you. You should come with me on tour. You are such a marvelous audience. You have been the best audience which I ever have had in my life. Yes, I think. You must not tell. I see it at every concert. Okay, when I have played Glenn Miller music, you have clapped very much. I think you like big band swing. Okay, then I play for you now the Trumpet Blues by Harry James.